So you may have heard recently about Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter. Along with it came significant changes to its policy, such as the unbanning of various accounts and the paywalling of that iconic blue checkmark. And that isn't even to mention that Musk himself, an avid tweeter, often finds himself embroiled in controversy after controversy. Things aren't going well at the site either. Advertisers are pulling out in droves, the company is experiencing mass layoffs, and a spotlight is being shown on other problems that the site has had, such as spam. But that spotlight has also come to shine on alternatives. Alternative platforms have generally tended to be a bit of a punchline, honestly. We've seen Steemit, we've seen Gab, Parler, hell, we've even seen one started by a former president, and even more mainstream apps like Hive. All of these have come and gone, dominating the press cycle for about a month or so before slowly dying out. For many of these, they often pitch themselves as run by different people, catering to a different audience and boasting a different moderation policy. With Elon's purchase of Twitter, something interesting has happened though. Those who were most at odds with Twitter's previous moderation policy have begun to return to the site, and those who were most accustomed to it have begun to search for alternatives. And this has brought the spotlight on to Mastodon for the time being. Now, this video is meant to not just be an introduction to Mastodon, but also the debates surrounding it and shine a light on the discussions which don't tend to get talked about as much. Now, let me be clear, Mastodon isn't new. It's been around since 2016, and this isn't the first time we've heard rumblings from a mass exodus to it. Twitter's moderation practices have long been criticized by various camps, and periodically a controversy arises which prompts people to switch over to Mastodon. The promise Mastodon holds stretches way beyond simply capitalizing on whatever the newest backlash is. Unlike every other platform, Mastodon looks to solve many of the problems faced by them, not by promising different management or by soliciting investor funding, but through a true embrace of free software principles and ingenious design. And I can say from personal experience that it has solved so many of the problems that I have had with Twitter. Despite nearly having 10,000 followers on Twitter, my posts would only be seen by a fraction of my followers, and receive paltry engagement to boot. Meanwhile, my posts on Mastodon, where I have less than a fifth of the following, gets seen and engaged with at nearly double, sometimes triple the numbers I usually get on Twitter. But it's not all about the numbers, and Mastodon is not without its hurdles. We'll get to that later. The fact is, Mastodon genuinely has the potential to do to social media what Linux has done and continues to do to desktop operating systems. Now that's a pretty bold claim, so I better make sure I back it up. Growing a successful social media platform requires two things. One is it has to be sustainable over the long term. There are going to be times where growth is slower, but you still need to ensure that you're able to maintain server costs, that there is someone there to continue to add features and squash bugs, even when it's not exciting. Previous platforms have often tried to deal with both of these issues by trying to accrue enough money to pay for all of it. Of course, you can't rely on that sort of growth indefinitely, which is a large part of why those companies fail. So if we want to avoid that fate, we need to think about this differently. All of these other companies start with the principle of how do we raise as much money as possible, whereas Mastodon starts with the principle of how do we minimize our operating costs as much as possible. And it's this train of thought which lends itself to the open source approach. The community fixes bugs, contributes features, and performs testing. The community also does the hosting. You see, Mastodon is decentralized, and here's where things are going to get a bit technical, so pay attention. Just like email, anyone can host their own server, creating what is essentially known as an instance. An instance is to Mastodon what an email provider is to email. Just as you can sign up on Gmail and still be able to send messages to your friends on Outlook, you can sign up on, say, mastodon.social, while still being able to interact with users on mastodon.online. I can follow them, I can message them, reply to them, favorite their posts, everything that I could do as if we were actually on the same site. Not only that, but my global timeline provides me a full mix of posts from the entire Mastodon ecosystem. See, the special sauce that makes all of this possible is not Mastodon itself, but it's what it's built on top of. Underlying Mastodon is a protocol known as ActivityPub. Think of it as a language, a standard for how social media sites can communicate with each other in a decentralized, also known as federated manner. ActivityPub is fundamentally generic, which means that it's not limited to Mastodon. You don't need to be on Mastodon to be part of the network. People have made their own networks, built on ActivityPub with different features. And yet, because they're all built on ActivityPub, Mastodon users can interact with them perfectly fine. And I hope that this right here hits home, because this is as powerful as it gets, folks. ActivityPub, and thereby Mastodon, is designed in a way where the interests of the individual and the interests of the community are no longer at odds. Splitting off and forming your own instance with your own rules, your own software, and your own community is not only possible, it's encouraged. For a lot of other platforms, splitting is something to fear. You want your users to stay on your own site because the more people that are using it, the more attractive it is to new and current members. My experience with YouTube and Twitter is partly informed by how many of my friends and favorite content creators are on there. If they weren't on Twitter, I'd be less likely to use it. This is what is known as the network effect, and it can pose a serious problem. The network effect is essentially the idea that there exists some services out there whose attractiveness increases with their size. This is especially the case for social media. You can have the best designed site in the world, but if nobody is using it, then it doesn't matter. This is the biggest reason why we talk about big tech, a market in which the biggest players are the ones who have the easiest time, especially when it comes to fending off competition. Countless communities have been killed by the network effect, and it's the #1 reason you still see the majority of people just assume that there's no point in resisting our Silicon Valley overlords. It's also why splitting can prove fatal for many communities. Within any initiative, there's always disagreements, and this is no different. Some disagree with the technology, thinking while Mastodon is a good idea, there's a better way to write the software. Some disagree with the moderation, thinking that the rules on a lot of the large instances are too strict. Some have issues with the community, wishing that they didn't have to see certain instances on their timeline. Maybe some were just never really into Twitter to begin with, but see the value in applying this principle of federation to other kinds of social media. If Mastodon was a traditional platform like Twitter, you'd have to resolve this by having a central team juggle all of the interests. They'd be picking out features which were the most popular, who to ban, who to not ban, and so on, just to make sure people don't go somewhere else. There'd be pressure to keep members in line and not defecting, as defecting would shrink the platform and thereby its value. But because Mastodon is federated, everyone is free to make and use their own services. They're free to run their own instances with their own rules. They're free to decide which other instances they do or do not want to federate with. And they're free to do all of this while still retaining the size of the overall network. If anything, it strengthens the network, as hosting costs, maintenance, and moderation is not all piled up onto one group, but spread across the whole community. This is what I mean when I say that where all these other quote-unquote alternative platforms promise, Mastodon guarantees. It's all in the design. That's the whole sales pitch, the one you'll hear across the internet a lot. But chances are there are a lot of you watching this video who have already heard all of this before. Now, we've already established that Mastodon has a lot of potential, but potential alone doesn't mean anything for success unless it's properly leveraged and executed well. Here's where we get to the part that Mastodon true believers won't like to hear, but it's something that many of us need to hear the most. Mastodon is incredibly flawed, and this has become even more glaringly obvious with the most recent exodus from Twitter. These problems are serious and could eventually end up really damaging Mastodon in the short term and killing the platform in the long term. However, and if you're going to remember any part of this, remember this: none of these problems are unfixable. There's this mentality I've noticed where when a problem is brought up, it's taken almost personally. You'll have those who either downplay or ignore it, and you'll have those who argue that because these problems are even there, Mastodon is doomed and everyone is better off using a different platform. This is ridiculous, of course. I mean, every platform has its issues, but the main difference here is that we have it within our ability to fix these problems. We don't have to wait for the Mastodon team. We don't even need to necessarily even be programmers to help out. So let's set the stage for that. So the first step, of course, is acknowledging the problems. So let's run through them because there's quite a few. Federation is Mastodon's biggest strength, but it's also a huge source of issues. Issues which in turn feed into other issues. Now, first off, there is no such thing as an automated spam filter on Mastodon, at least nowhere to the same extent as modern methods. You know how you sometimes get a spam message on Twitter or Discord or Reddit? Moderators of Mastodon instances often have to deal with swatting multiple spam accounts a day, And if they don't, spam will begin to flood the feed. Now this is if they leave their registration open, but there are other ways you can handle signups. You can have it where invite codes are needed to register, or you can have it where any signups have to be manually approved by a moderator. These mitigate the spam problem and are very common across Mastodon, but now there's a new problem. It puts major roadblocks in the way of new users actually getting an account. People want convenience, and they don't want to be confused. Even as something as simple as a manual approval process is enough to deter a lot of people. This isn't even to mention the number of instances which outright have closed registrations, where getting an invite code often involves either having connections or doing digging to find a way in. But all of this assumes that you've already found an instance you want to join. A lot of people don't even get to that part. In order to find an instance you want to join, first you need to figure out what that even means. And this is something which people consistently have a hard time wrapping their head around, especially if they don't have a friend explaining it to them. And what we're seeing time and time again, especially with this recent surge of attention, is that people hear about Mastodon and try to sign up, but quickly give up after quite a bit of confusion. Plenty of other sites have had problems, issues with using it which deter people, but Mastodon's in an especially bad situation because, get this, for the first time, the issue is that people don't even know how to get past the step of making an account. But Mastodon has instance selection tools on the website and their app, right? Sure, but it doesn't change the fact that in order to pick a suitable instance, you still have to know what's going on, you have to know which settings to filter for, and account for factors which these tools are not going to account for. Almost every widely used instance list, to my knowledge, is on some level automated. Yes, you can filter out instances based on objective metrics, such as user count or tags, but it's often the less cut and dry and more ambiguous metrics which matter the most. Level of spam, how restrictive the moderation policy is, how sustainable upkeeping the instance is. These are all factors which can't be judged so easily, but they're also some of the most important towards having a good experience. You don't want to be surrounded by spam bots, you don't want the instance with your account to shut down suddenly, and you don't want to be unreasonably banned. It happens, and it really sucks when it happens. And embarrassingly, these sorts of stories have undeniably played a large role in scaring some folks off from Mastodon. And all of this can be especially fatal because when you pick an instance, you're kinda locked into it for the most part. Sure, there are ways to move over your followers and following, but we're not talking about a truly nomadic identity. At this point, there's still a cost to switching instances. At this time, your posts cannot be migrated between them. Losing your posts is a big deal, and that cost in a lot of ways does lock you down to one instance. If you've been suspended, if you're tired of your current instance, or just happen to have your instance go offline, your posts aren't coming back. Imagine that. On a decentralized platform, you still find yourself locked into one instance like that. That's a problem. But even apart from that, you can still feel locked in other ways. You only get one local timeline, which means one instance on which your posts will show. One instance in which you can easily browse the local posts. This can be an issue as people can have multiple interests or multiple communities in which their contributions would be relevant. Say you're an artist. You'd obviously want your work to be seen by as many people who would be interested in it as possible, but you'd really only be able to showcase it in one instance, even if it's an art-themed one. What about people on other art instances? I'm sure that they'd love to see your stuff too. Maybe you're just into multiple things and you want to keep up with art timelines, but also video game themed ones. On Twitter, the algorithm would mix the content accordingly, but here we have to rely on timelines to make that possible. So going through each of these, what fixes would be needed? For signups, you could have a manually curated instance list, which probably would help, especially if you can distribute invite links in a fashion that would keep out spam bots. For the instance of being locked into an instance, post-migration would obviously have to be implemented, and there'd have to be a proper aliasing system so that one can have their presence across multiple timelines. Of course, these are just ideas, rough starting points to show that even if there are problems, there are solutions too. Putting all this together, it really keeps coming back to what I said earlier. Instances are Mastodon's greatest strength, but also its biggest hurdle. The strength is that it really brings something different to the table. There's openness and decentralization, but in a fashion which actually does hold potential to scale to the needs of the modern web. The issue is, it brings something different. There's a lot of complexity, with the concept of instances proving confusing, or which could disrupt what otherwise would be seamless. But as I said earlier, this can be fixed. It's a matter of design. The same way we'll often take a complex electrical circuit and treat it as a single black box, we can mask over a lot of the complexity surrounding instances by ensuring the onboarding experience is as seamless as possible. As soon as you run into a hiccups like everything being listed above, that's often where the concept of instances have to be explained. That can be the final nail in a potential new user's patience. There's quite a few of these issues, and it can often seem like playing whack-a-mole, trying to solve them all. But that's how it is for any complex system. There's going to be problems whose solutions aren't clear, but if we're being honest, that's just how things have been for humanity in general. We're faced with a problem that we have to put our heads together to fix. And we're stronger when we do it together. Governments have had to deal with it, and even companies like Twitter have had to deal with it. The difference for Mastodon is that we can't rely, or maybe we don't have to rely on a central management directing engineers to work on what's most relevant. There's no paycheck. There's no expected number of hours contributors are supposed to be clocked in for. What it does have, though, is something that we often take for granted: a fully open design and foundation. Openness doesn't just exist for transparency, nor does it exist so we have stuff for free, even if both of these are important in their own right. Openness gives us agency. It puts the power in our hands. Regular people like you and me, who maybe aren't affiliated with any official team or project. This is the power to decide for ourselves what direction we want to take the platform, what problems we want to fix, what communities we want to host, and what kind of internet we want to see. Chances are there are ways you can help, even if you don't think so. Do you know how to program? You can contribute to various apps and tools surrounding Mastodon or even Mastodon itself. Do you speak multiple languages? You can help translate documentation and various resources relevant to the project. Do you know how to make videos? Make basic tutorials showing people how to do simple stuff on Mastodon, short enough to where the ordinary person can follow along. Do you have quite a bit of spare time in the day? Find a small instance and offer to help moderate it and filter out spam. Do you have a little bit of extra cash? Maybe donate to one of your favorite Mastodon instances to help with operating costs. And even if you have none of the above, if you still use Mastodon regularly, file bug reports on GitHub. If you notice something not working properly or see someone on the main timeline complaining, file a report, because that's how these things get fixed. And there's a lot more out there that you can do. It's just a matter of looking at what people need and how it relates to you yourself. It doesn't need to be major, because the number one obstacle is not any one feature, but a mentality. This mentality of a conventional web, where if you have an issue, the solution is in your hands. If you know anyone in the community, start working with them, talk to them, and see what you can do. Get thinking about what personally bothers you and what steps you can take towards fixing that problem. On the other hand, if this is your first time hearing about Mastodon, go ahead and check it out. I'll be putting a link in the description where you can get started with minimal hassle. I think that's going to do it for this video though. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a blessed day. I'll see you next time. Have a good one.